This is a very iterative type of research. So this is something that I'm presenting to you today as a result of this realist review, but we do in fact, we are going to go forward and further refine these results in the future. So if you have any comments in that way, I'd love to hear them as well. So on that note, I'm just going to quickly share my screen. So just give me a moment to set this up and we'll get started. Okay. So as was mentioned, my presentation today is going to really be following the results of a realist review. As Adnan said, it's entitled Understanding How Newly Implemented Rehabilitation Best Practices Are Sustained. So I conducted this review with my two supervisors, Dr. Sara Ahmed and Aliki Thomas, as well as a fellow PhD student, Alam Zidan. So by no means was this done alone, but just by me. So before I really dive into the results of this review and the recommendations that I really want to focus on for our own practices coming out of this review, I'm just going to discuss some key concepts and then really why this review is important, why this topic is important to care about the sustainability of rehabilitation practices before we get to that interpretation. So to start off, I want to just briefly highlight what evidence-based practices are in rehabilitation. So evidence-based practices, or EBPs, are practices known to optimize rehabilitation outcomes. Now, unfortunately, EBPs are often underutilized by rehabilitation clinicians, and this is, true across Canada in the Quebec context as well. There's evidence for PTs, OTs, and SLPs. But there are a lot of processes we can use to address this underutilization, one of which is implementation. So very, very broadly, implementation is the process to increase the uptake of evidence-based practices into clinical practice. And there's a wide range of sub-processes under this. So it starts with, identifying a knowledge gap, finding the research or the evidence-based practice that fits that gap, implementing it, evaluating outcomes, and hopefully sustaining that evidence-based practice over the long term. So more recently, there has been a shift in focus from that initial implementation and adoption of an evidence-based practice to having some more concern with the sustainability of that evidence-based practice, or the use of that evidence-based practice more over the long term. I think this concern can really be encapsulated well by this short quote from Shearer and Deering in 2011, in which they state, "Why bother with what is effective if it is also fleeting?" So very, very quickly, I just want to talk a little bit more about what evidence-based practice sustainability is. I put quite a hefty definition in this slide. I don't want it to overwhelm you. What I really want to take away from this slide is that sustainability has a bunch of different concepts embedded in it. It's not a straightforward idea. It has many different ways to define it, and different ways to look at it. So quickly, as we do this definition, so we kind of understand some of the concepts within sustainability. So this definition states, after a defined period of time, the EBP continues to be delivered, individual behavior change is maintained, the EBP and individual behavior change may evolve or adapt while continuing to produce benefits for individuals and for systems. So you can see there's a lot of components in sustainability. It does make it a complex concept. So now that we understand a bit better what sustainability is and what we're really focusing then on in this presentation today, within this review that I'm going to discuss with you, why does sustainability matter? Why did we do this review in the first place? And why are you here today listening to this presentation? Well, if we look at the wider healthcare literature, it actually shows us that only 40 to 60% of newly implemented evidence-based practices are actually sustained over the long term. So this is a very poor sustainability rate. And this lack of sustainability leads to many negative consequences. This includes wasted funding. It includes negative perceptions of implementation projects by implementation stakeholders, leads to a loss of potential improvements in quality of care and patient benefits. And this can also lead to or exacerbate existing health service inequities. So now that we understand why sustainability matters, what it is, what do we know about it in the literature? So this is what we knew about it prior to this review I'll discuss with you today. So prior to this review, we had a lot of information actually about the core influential components of sustainability. So they are really comprehensively described and identified. And these 4 components were strategies, or the systematic methods, which hopefully optimize the sustainability of an evidence-based practice, the context or the environmental of the clinical practice context, which can either act as facilitators or barriers, the mechanisms, so the human reasoning or human decision-making, which underlies why an evidence-based practice is sustained or not, and then the outcomes, which are the measurements of sustainability success. So although we knew quite a lot about each of those components individually, what we didn't understand was how they fit together. In other words, we didn't know how sustainability worked according to those influential components, the things we knew affected the sustainability of evidence-based practices as a collective. If we better understand how sustainability works according to these components, we could produce recommendations to optimize EDP sustainability, which incorporates all of these ideas, all of these influential components into those recommendations. So identifying this need and this possibility of recommendation development to improve the sustainability of evidence-based practices in rehabilitation, those 2 things together actually led us to our objective for this review and conducting this review. So really the objective we sought to address was to understand under what conditions, so context, how, the mechanisms, and for what duration an evidence-based rehabilitation practice is sustained, or the outcome. So as I previously mentioned, we conducted a realist review to address this objective. And this is a bit more of an unusual review type, especially when compared to things like systematic reviews or scoping reviews, which perhaps you in the audience have more experience with. So I'm going to quickly, very quickly, just highlight the methods we went through in our realist review and then move on to the results and the interpretation of those. So the methods in a realist review at a high level are very similar to a scoping review and a systematic review. So you can see that in steps 1 to 5 on the left-hand side of this slide. The one thing I do want to highlight, though, that does differ quite a bit from these other review types is that stakeholder consultation in the realist review is actually embedded throughout the review. And this is something we did quite consciously as part of our realist review. So to start, we clarified the scope of the review in consultation with stakeholders. And specifically, we did this by developing the objective and the initial theory, which would guide the review. So specifically, stakeholders really helped us identify the theory of planned behavior and normalization process theory as 2 theories which would underlie our understanding of how the sustainability of evidence-based practices work in rehabilitation. After doing that, we then searched for evidence and selected documents. To do this, we looked in a variety of electronic databases, as well as using a diverse range of other methods as well. And this included reference list searching of already included documents, as well as targeted searches in websites, including like more practice-focused websites and research-focused websites, which we thought would have relevant documents to us. In total, we ended up including 115 documents in this review, which represented 61 unique implementation projects. After we selected all these documents, we moved to extraction and synthesis, and we ended up using 2 separate methods for extraction and synthesis. The first was via Excel, in which we extracted basic study data and sustainability characteristics, and then we analyzed this information numerically. So really, we got a lot of information about frequencies on these variables. The other method was really the bulk, ended up having the bulk of our results in this review. And this was via NVivo, which is a qualitative analysis software. And this software allowed us or enabled us to code context, mechanism, outcome, and strategy text individually. So those 4 key components I discussed earlier. And then we use a realist synthesis method called iterative, deductive, and inductive retroduction. And that's a bit of a mouthful for an analysis technique. But what it essentially means is that we took each of those individually coded pieces of text and we put them together to form explanatory statements which incorporated all 4 of those components. So specifically, we created explanatory statements with all 4 of those components to help us explain how sustainability works in rehabilitation. So you can see a visual representation of that on the bottom right-hand side of this slide, where context, strategy, mechanism, and outcome text all come together. So that's really it, very quickly, in a very quick nutshell, the methods that we went through in this review. I'm now going to do a little bit about the numerical results and highlight a few things here before moving more on to those explanatory statements, which form really the bulk of our results and the bulk of the recommendations. The practical recommendations are coming out of that. So this chart here just has a bunch of different frequencies we calculated. The one thing I really want to highlight, which I think is very key for you and our audience today, is that the documents that we included in this review really represented a wide variety of settings. But more specifically for us today, 30% of the rehabilitation projects included in this review were actually in rehabilitation hospitals and clinics specifically. So highly relevant for us. But where I really want to focus our attention in this numerical analysis section is this chart here. So this chart actually really tells us how important the use of different theories, models, and frameworks are in implementation and sustainability planning to really help guide us in that, as well as the importance of targeted sustainability planning. And by that, I mean sustainability planning as a distinct process to planning for initial implementation, initial adoption of the evidence-based practice, as the considerations for those 2 things, this kind of more short-term planning and more long-term planning, are actually quite different. So let's go take a look at this chart and see how this chart is telling us that these things are important. So if we look at these red highlighted numbers first, we can actually see that theory, model, and framework use if a authors report theory, model, and framework use, then what they actually did was sustain the evidence-based practice 67% of the time in the included articles. And we can contrast that to the cell below it. So if a theory, model, or framework was not used as part as implementation planning or sustainability planning, then the evidence-based practice was actually only sustained 20% of the time. So you can see a really large dichotomy between those frequencies, implying a very large influence of theory, model, framework use and its relationship to sustainability of an evidence-based practice. Really similarly, if we go down and look at the green numbers, we can see that if sustainability planning was reported by authors, then the evidence-based practice was sustained 89% of the time. And if sustainability planning was not used, then the evidence-based practice is only sustained 49% of the time. So again, we see this very clear relationship here. What I also want to highlight, though, in regards to sustainability planning, which I think is equally important, is the relative underutilization of sustainability planning in rehabilitation. So if we look over to the far right-hand side of the chart, we can see that, in fact, only 26% of the time sustainability planning was used across the included articles. The other 74% of the time, no one reported sustainability specific planning or described sustainability specific planning. So this is definitely a key area that we can improve as a field as it regards evidence-based practice sustainability. So that ends off the more numerical analysis stuff that I wanted to highlight. Now I'm going to really look at these explanatory statements, start by understanding what they look like, what they are, and then talk about how they can help us in our practice and actually provide us with specific recommendations as to how to improve evidence-based practice sustainability. So in our review, we actually identified 52 different explanatory statements. So you can see I've just listed a whole bunch of them on the right. Let's not read that. Instead, I've just pulled one out that we can read together and understand how the context, strategies, mechanisms, and outcome information can all come together into a single explanatory narrative. So looking at explanatory statement number 1, which I've blown up here, It states if clinicians or clinician managers have autonomy over their own work and retain knowledge of the evidence-based practice, so that's the context, through ongoing training, strategy, then they will value the evidence-based practice mechanism, which results in its continued use as the outcome. So we can see how we put together all four of those components into one explanatory narrative. Now, I've included a couple more here, I'm not going to go through them both in detail, but I just wanted to show this to you so you can take a look at the diversity of strategies, contexts, mechanisms, and outcomes that can be included in these explanatory statements. So we had quite a large range of differences in these concepts. One thing I want to highlight in explanatory statement number 23, so the top one on this slide, is that sustainability specific planning is actually the strategy in this one. So although in the numerical analysis, I highlighted that there weren't that many examples comparatively of sustainability specific planning in the included articles, we did have enough to show how it can be highly influential and lead to sustained evidence-based practices. The other thing I want to highlight on this slide is in the second explanatory statement I've listed here, so number 52. And this one's a bit unique compared to the other two we've looked at because this one actually explains an instance in which an evidence-based practice is not sustained. So we did actually identify 12 explanatory statements that do explain unsustained evidence-based practices as opposed to sustained evidence-based practices. I pulled out this one because I really wanted to highlight that there are instances where evidence-based practices not being sustained isn't necessarily a negative outcome. And in fact, it could be the appropriate outcome in some cases. So I think this statement actually shows that really well. So if we read through this statement, we can see that, I think, more clearly. So this statement states, when data is related to clinicians showing there are no benefits to the evidence-based practice for clinicians or patients, then the practice will not continue to be used because clinicians have a negative attitude about the practice. So in this instance, the contextual feature is that there's really no benefits for the clinicians or patients. And this may represent a very appropriate situation in which continuing the practice is in fact the positive, or sorry, not continuing the practice is in fact the positive or appropriate outcome. So I wanted to highlight that because throughout this presentation thus far, I have focused on a lack of sustainability as being more negative, but that is in fact not always true, and I don't want to give that impression. So this now brings me to the next kind of stage of actually synthesis that we completed. So after recognizing or identifying 52 explanatory statements, we decided to synthesize these further since we had so many. We did this so that way we could see some higher patterns and have different, a higher level understanding of what we were seeing, but also so we could organize them in a way that they could be used more practically and more easily by implementation teams, for example, in practice. So they could actually provide recommendations in an easier way. And it is this latter reason or this latter application that I'm really going to focus on today about that practical application. So to be able to do that, I'm going to go through kind of how to read this visual representation of our synthesized explanatory statements, which we've termed our refined theory. So just very quickly looking at this diagram on this slide, we can see that our refined theory, our visual representation, has 3 different colored boxes to it. And this is like the key portion that we have to understand how to read. So the green boxes represent enabling contextual factors or facilitators. The red represent inhibiting contextual factors or barriers. And the blue represents outcomes. Now, for you eagle-eyed people, you can see that there are boxes that are both green and blue. And that is because in some explanatory statements, we actually found that the constructs represented in those boxes are actually contextual factors. And in other explanatory statements, that same construct is actually an outcome. And that is why it is coded as both of those colors, because it can be both of those things. So now that we just have a basic understanding of what that visual representation looks like, I'm going to go through quickly the basic steps, the general steps of how to apply now that visual representation and the explanatory statements such that we can optimize the sustainability of an evidence-based practice in our own contexts. So here I've listed 3 basic steps for that. So to get this sustainability guidance, these very specific recommendations from these results, we start by either assessing or identifying sustainability constructs. And what I mean by that is, we assess or identify contextual features or barriers and facilitators, which is quite common. You can identify some problem mechanisms of things that might resonate with you as a member of that clinical practice that you want to implement the evidence-based practice into or sustain it in. And then you can also identify outcomes that you wish to achieve. So what are your goals in that regard? Once you identify those constructs, you match the ones you've identified that are relevant to you to those described in that refined theory to find relevant explanatory statements that match that construct. Then you use those explanatory statements to select appropriate strategies to address your needs. So this, I think, is a bit abstract, just working through it like that. So I'm going to go through a hypothetical example with you now to really apply these steps and apply the results of this review. So in my hypothetical example, starting with step 1, which is assessing or identifying barriers and facilitators or other sustainability constructs which are most relevant to you, I identified that a major facilitator in my context for this evidence-based practice is clinician autonomy. So in other words, clinicians have the authority to make decisions over their practice with regards to this evidence-based practice. So if I go through the constructs listed in the visual representation, I see actually in this box that I've ringed in red that the construct there is autonomy and positive social atmosphere. So I select that box knowing that any explanatory statements, any numbered statements there that are within that box might be most relevant to me because of this contextual factor I've identified. So using this box, I see that explanatory statements 1 to 4 and 18 to 20 are actually matching that construct of autonomy for me. So to narrow down further those 7 statements, I mean, you can read them all through and see just generally what resonates with you, but you can also identify other, constructs that you think are important or that you want to achieve. So for example, I can identify maybe that continued use is the outcome that I want to achieve, that's my goal. So if I identify continued use as my outcome and the contextual factor, the facilitator as clinician autonomy, then putting those 2 things together, what I actually get is 1 explanatory statement out of those 7. And that is explanatory statement number 1, which we've actually already seen a few slides ago. So if I go through this statement again, which I've listed in step number 3, I can see that the strategy in that explanation is actually ongoing training. So in other words, what this explanatory statement is telling me is that according to the contextual factor that I know I have as a strong facilitator, and according to the outcome that I want to achieve, the strategy that I could use that might be especially relevant to me and especially useful in enhancing sustainability in this way is ongoing training. So I do want to highlight, as we kind of coming more towards the end of our presentation, that the theory that I've just presented to you and the explanatory statements are just hypothetical, let's say. They are actually already being used in practice. So specifically as part of my PhD work, I am working within the Mayo Portland Adaptability Inventory Project, or the MPI-4 project, which is meant to implement the MPI-4 into stroke rehabilitation programs at 3 different sites, including JRH. So as part of the collaborative planning for this project, we are using and applying this refined theory and the explanatory statements to help us, help guide us in our sustainability planning. So as a quick example from the MPI-4 project of how we're directly applying an explanatory statement in our planning, I provided this example here. So we know that there's quite a bit of turnover amongst key stakeholders actually across all 3 sites. And just to make this a bit more specific to JRH, who make up a lot of our audience members, I believe, there actually are also currently stroke rehabilitation staff shortages there. So taking this information together, knowing that there is currently turnover and there might continue to be some for quite some time, we identified a statement, explanatory statement number 20, as particularly useful to us in our planning. So this statement says, especially if there is turnover, ongoing training is needed to signal that the evidence-based practice is an expected part of duties, so that clinicians continue to feel confident in their ability to perform the practice, resulting in continued expertise amongst clinicians. So this statement actually guided us not only in recognizing that we need to develop ongoing training that can be planned for new clinicians, but it also nudged us to the fact that we also require booster training, or may require booster training on an ongoing basis for all clinicians as new advances are being made to the MPI-4 such that expertise is maintained in the MPI-4. So taking a step back from these very specific recommendations that came out of the result of this review that I just went through via the explanatory statements and that theory, I do want to end off this presentation just with some higher level recommendations to all the stakeholders who are typically involved in sustainability of an evidence-based practice, or even its earlier implementation as well. So specifically for implementation planning teams, the use of sustainability guidance to optimize sustainability is so important. If you take nothing else out of this review and the results that came out of this, it's that really we have a long way to go across all healthcare fields, but there are some very significant gaps that this review exposed in rehabilitation. So whenever possible, use sustainability guidance and do sustainability specific planning. For clinicians, managers, or anyone else who is directly using an evidence-based practice, it's very important to be honest and open about what is working with that evidence-based practice and what is not. So it's very hard to create targeted sustainability planning and find ways to sustain an evidence-based practice in a very targeted way when the implementation teams aren't sure of what they're targeting. They don't know what the problems are. They don't know what's going really well. And then finally, for researchers, it's very important not only to evaluate implementation outcomes, but also to evaluate those longer term outcomes, those sustainability outcomes. This means that you have longer term planning in terms of research projects, research funding, etc. But this is definitely an area where a lot more research needs to be done, and there's much less information available when compared to implementation or earlier implementation phases. So that then concludes the content portion of my presentation. I want to thank you all for listening to me, and I'm very happy now to take any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was super informative. We're going to take questions from the chat and also in person. So if you guys have any questions, you can either raise your hand or just unmute your mic and ask your question. I have a question in the chat. So an exceptional presentation showing critical thinking, scientific rigor, clarity, and key messages. Nice slides, easy to follow. I have a question regarding practice sustainability from Claude Zenauger.
Okay, Claudine, do you want to unmute yourself and ask me? Thank you for the
Yes, I will, Rebecca. I'll just turn on also my camera. It seems like it doesn't want to turn on. Okay, there it is. Really appreciated the presentation, and I'll just jump directly to my question so I have time for others. Yesterday, I attended the presentation of Dr. Janice Hang, who just received a nomination at Université Laval, and her talk was about implementation. And one question that she addressed is the fact that sometimes there is a practice that is there in the setting that clinicians, well, there's no longer, well, it's been shown that there's no evidence to support it, and you have to change these practices. I'm wondering in your review if you saw any of this, and she said that there is really less research on that aspect. How do you change that, let's say, old pattern to a new one? And so I'm curious to see.
Yeah. So I guess the technical term that's coming out of the literature for that is de-implementation. So taking a practice that is no longer seen as effective, or something else maybe needs to replace it. And that idea of getting rid of that practice so something else can fill the gap, or maybe no gap there needs to be filled. So I didn't so much look at that directly in the sense that it's kind of coming out as a separate process in and of itself. However, I think an aspect of sustainability, and was actually included in the definition that I gave in this presentation, is evolution and adaptation. And that continued evolution and adaptation is quite an important component to sustainability. So there is a bit of an overlap there. And so your question is, I think, very valid in this context. So all that to say, I guess, in short, there's not specific information in this presentation, or, specifically I didn't look for that, but things that are talking about that continual adaptation, that continual evolution within the explanatory statement, of which there are some, might overlap a bit with this idea and could be informative.
Mm-hmm. And maybe I have a sub question. I don't see other hands raised, so I'll ask. So if the new practice has to replace an old one, did you see some aspects where it's actually like switching? And even if you're focusing on the new practice, I was just wondering if this presents a more challenge or an opportunity, maybe, when you bring something to replace?
Yeah, I would say, I think a bit of both. I mean, you have the opportunity in the sense that you're working from something that already exists, which can be helpful, but the challenge, I think, is also there if you're working from something that already exists, which can also be more difficult depending on the mindset of people you're working with, the resources available, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So I did see that a bit. I especially saw it because, again, of the way the concept that I was looking at was more sustainability as opposed to de-implementation. I saw it more in terms of that continual evolution, that continual adaptation. So not so much moving from one one practice to more of a different one, but more of that evolution of that practice over time, where, new evidence is coming out with regarding that same practice. So you might need some changes that are pretty continual, yeah, stuff like that. Yeah. Thanks for your questions, Claudine.
Do we have any other questions, either from the chat or by video? As I kind of alluded to at the beginning of the presentation, if there's things that really stood out to you and you're like, that really resonated with me, like, I would love to hear that. Or if I've said stuff and you're like, that explanatory statement, like, Rebecca, like, that doesn't resonate with me at all. I've never experienced that. That's valuable information to me as well. Because, as I said, I am going to continually refine this in some of my projects moving forward. Yeah. If not, that's okay too. We're going to be making the presentation public on the CRIR website. So if ever people want to rewatch it and then they have questions later on, they can probably email you. Oh, we have a question. Okay.
So the question is, how did the consultation process run throughout the study? Okay, so what we actually did is we had a diverse range of people that we reached out to. So actually, I reached out to researchers outside of the research team who are experts more in sustainability specifically. I reached out to some clinical research coordinators. So I am very thankful for their feedback, as well as a few managers, some clinicians. So we actually ended up having quite I guess, hefty group of stakeholders in rehabilitation specifically, whenever possible. And so they really, as I highlighted at the beginning, or in the methods especially, they really helped us at the beginning. And then they actually helped us as well during the extraction and the analysis process, which actually was very iterative. So it was very much cyclical. So I would do some analysis, we'd go back to the stakeholders that we had worked with from the beginning, and then they gave us suggestions, or they told us things kind of exactly like what I just asked the group about, if something really resonates with you, or if you really disagree with a statement. And then we dug into why or why not, and that really informed our analysis again. So we kept doing this cycle until we hit a point where we felt we'd done everything we could with the documents that we had included, the documents that we had. Does that answer your question, Bonnie?
Yes, thank you. I'm just trying to get through my head how it really differs from a scoping review.
Okay.
So that was where my question was going.
Yeah, so that's a question actually I've got a few times, because realist reviews are a little unusual. So people are trying to, I think as much as possible, kind of, understand them in relation to what they know. So systematic reviews, scoping reviews. The difference in a lot of cases, well, to me, I think one of the core differences is the way that the results are presented. Like in a realist review, it's very explanatory, and the result, I guess, basic unit of the result is those explanatory statements, as opposed to identifying, all the contextual features, all the strategies, all the mechanisms, all the outcomes, for example, as would be perhaps more appropriate in a scoping review. But the consultation can be, it can be similar depending, I guess, how you approach it. Okay. I have a question from Vaughn. Do you have another question? Sorry.
No, I just wanted to say thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so from Ivy, I'll just read this. Thank you very much. Okay, okay. Oh, thank you. Those are great comments, Ivy. I really appreciate knowing this resonated with you, and you see it as an important area to discuss or talk about. If you have anything else you want to say, feel free to unmute yourself if you're comfortable doing so.
I'll show myself. Well, I just wanted to thank you for this, because we do see this a lot in clinical practice and various layers of change. And I am familiar a bit of the MI situation you're dealing with. I'm not from the JRH, but it's a different scenario of how the implementation and sustainability of the project is going through. So yes, if you do not assess that component when you're implementing a new practice in rehab, it really doesn't like pan out the project. So yeah, something that we all have to think about. Yeah, I think it's something, as again I alluded to, it's something historically we haven't thought as much about. Perhaps maybe it's not as exciting or something, or it just takes longer to get to. So by that time, it's, that initial momentum is maybe less or something. But I think it's really important. It's an area that we need to think about further for all the reasons that I mentioned. And we want to avoid those negative consequences whenever possible, or recognize maybe when something not being sustained is really appropriate. I may ask, is it possible to get that checklist of the components that you're talking about? Because we're actually starting a project here at the site, and I'd like to make, and sustainability is part of our planning. So I'd like to actually name this challenges that we're foreseeing. But I think with your checklist, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, so I'm actually, I'm glad you asked this question. Thank you. I meant to mention this. I'm actually in the publication process of these results right now. So what I can do is just quickly talk to I'll consult with my other people on this review, and just make sure that they are okay with me giving you these unpublished results. I really want to, give guidelines and guidance whenever possible. For your use in this project specifically, but in general, I'll be able to more widely disseminate this information once the results are published.
And if ever they're going to have access to the recording, if ever they want to go back to.
Yes,
take
yeah.
that.
So yeah, so not all the results are here in the sense that they're, again, 52 explanatory statements, and I only presented a few of them. So yeah, you can imagine there's a lot of other stuff there.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, if there's another one. I'll wait a little bit to see. If not, I think your presentation was very clear and very thorough and very interesting as well. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for doing this presentation. And thank you everyone else for attending and listening. And yeah, if there's no more questions, we can end it here.
All right. Thank you all again for me too, for attending. I really appreciate your interest.
Thank you.